Okay, I want to continue my discussion of Descartes. In the last lecture, I was talking about some of the problems that come from Cartesian dualism when you split the mind and the body. Descartes believed the mind and body were totally different substances, and by definition, substances do not interact. The mind is not physical. The brain is physical, the mind is not. And the question is, how do they interact? And that's the mind-body problem. I talked about that last time. Then there's a problem of the skepticism about the external world. For Descartes, the self, or the thinking, the soul, or the mind is cut off from the world outside. So, for example, when there's a person, right? When a person looks at, let's say, an apple, light waves come from the apple to the person's eyes. They impinge on the retina, sets up a sequence of electrochemical reactions, and ultimately, whatever, it's very complicated. It's not really important to know the story unless that's what your expertise is. But ultimately, at the end of the process, there's a perception. You actually see something. What you have in your mind is, so basically what's happening is that from the apple you get light waves impinge on the retina. That sets up a sequence of electrochemical transactions, and then there's a perception. Descartes believed in what's called the representational theory of perception, which is that what you see is not the apple. What you see is an image in your mind. It's a representation of the apple. And that leads to the question of, how do you know there's an apple out there? How do you know there's anything out there other than what's in your mind? Because you don't see the apple. You see a representation of the apple. And and basically the same thing applies for anything else. If you look at a tree, light waves come from the tree, impinge on the retina of your eye, sets up a sequence of electrochemical transactions, and that ultimately results in a perception of a tree. Of a representation of a tree. The question then becomes, is there a tree outside you? Is there a world outside of you? Or is just everything virtual reality? That's the question of skepticism about the external world. And that becomes a real problem with Descartes. Even as late as 1800, a couple hundred years after Descartes, Immanuel Kant is still complaining about this. Immanuel Kant says it's a scandal that philosophers have never been able to prove the existence of the external world. So Kant took that problem very seriously. Okay, so that's the second problem with Cartesian dualism. Not only is there the mind-body problem, which later on there's a whole chapter 5 is all about the mind-body problem, so we'll go into detail there. There's also the problem about is there an external world? Basically, for Descartes, you have subjects totally separated from a world, because all we have are inner representations. And that leads to the question of, is there anything outside of our mind that corresponds to those? Okay, so Berkeley, many people are going to deal with that. Berkeley will deal with it. Locke will deal with it. So it's a very important question for the next couple hundred years. Another problem with Cartesian dualism is the problem skepticism about external minds, about other minds. How do you know that there are other minds in the world besides your own? Because for Descartes, you have a mind. So take you yourself. You have a mind, and you have direct access to your mind. You don't have direct access to other people's minds. You don't know that other people have minds. Descartes would say you have to infer that they have minds by what they do. When you're talking to another person, I guess you assume that they have a mind. How can they talk to you? I mean, how can they answer your questions and so on? But you don't know. Maybe they're just maybe they're very complicated computers. And there's nothing going on inside. Or as one philosopher, kind of pretty famous philosopher nowadays, Dave Chalmers says, is maybe they're zombies, philosophical zombies. A zombie is in the philosophical literature. A zombie is, just like you and me, just like everybody else, except they do everything we do. They write books, they talk, and they get married and so on. The only difference between a zombie and you is that a zombie, there's nothing going on inside. There's no mind. There's no consciousness. There's nothing. No beliefs, no desires. no pain, no pleasure. They have all the proper actions and reactions and behavior, but there's nothing going on inside. And Descartes says that's a problem. How do we know that how do you know that there are other minds other than your own? That's the problem of other minds. Another question, a problem with Descartes, is the problem of sleep. For Descartes, you are essentially a mind, a thinking being. Descartes says that's what you are essentially. You're not a body. The very essence of a mind is to think. And by that he means to be conscious. He's not just talking about conceptually thinking. Thinking for Descartes is any type of consciousness, any type of, when you see red or blue, or when you're in pain or pleasure, when you're thinking, you have beliefs and desires. Any conscious experience for Descartes is a form of thinking. It's a form of thinking. I lost my train of thought. Problem of other minds. Oh yes, I was sorry about that. Okay, sleep. The problem is sleep. For Descartes, the mind is essentially thinking. It's always conscious. Now, what happens if you go into a dreamless sleep? You know, you have you're just asleep and there's no dreaming, no consciousness whatsoever. Is that possible? Or think of when you go to the hospital and you get anesthesia. You know, you get anesthesia and an hour can go by and like you have no awareness whatsoever of what has happened. Or let's say you have a concussion, you get into an accident or something, and you're totally unconscious for a couple hours, right? That happens a lot. People go into comas. They have no awareness. For Descartes, that is impossible. It cannot be, because if you truly have no conscious experience whatsoever, you would not be a mind. You would not be a soul. You would not exist. So for Descartes, the very idea that you could be unconscious, have no conscious experience whatsoever, is impossible. So he would say that if you were in a coma, or if you had a concussion, or if you under anesthesia, there has to be some minimal degree of conscious experience, because you are a soul. And that's the very essence of a soul, is to be conscious. So for Descartes, it's impossible to have zero conscious experience. You have to have some degree. So that's another problem. Now, if you're saying, well, you know, the fact is that there are cases in life where we do have zero consciousness. Well, that would be a problem for Descartes. You know, Descartes could not explain that, because that would undermine Descartes' view. Okay, now there's another problem concerning animals. Descartes believed that human beings are essentially minds. If I asked Descartes, you know, who am I? Descartes would say, you know what you are? You're a mind. And I say, well, what about my body? Descartes would say that your body is not you. You are a mind. You happen to be in a body, but you are not your body. You are a mind. You are a thinking thing. That is your very essence. So that raises a question. And Descartes would also say that only human beings have minds. Of all the think of all the animals, all the forms of life in our world, only human beings have a soul. Only human beings have a mind. Cats don't have minds. Dogs don't have minds. Well, you say, well, what are they? They're just, for Descartes, all animals other than human beings are basically very, very complicated machines. Now, he didn't call them computers. Nowadays, they probably call them computers, but he says they're very complicated machines. They might appear to have consciousness. They might appear to, you know, experience pain or pleasure, but they don't. It's just it's pain behavior. So Descartes would say only human beings have a soul. All other animals are just complicated machines. We have a soul, but our body, Descartes would say, is just a complicated machine. So if I hurt my hand doesn't hurt. What hurts is my soul. It's all mental. So that's a problem, because, you know, if you love animals, it's a big problem, because if you're a Cartesian, you're definitely not going to be advocating animal rights, because you don't think animals can experience pain or pleasure. So there's no such thing from a Cartesian standpoint. There's no such thing as cruelty to animals because animals cannot feel pain. You can't be cruel to an animal. It's like if I took a rock and threw it through a window. You're going to hear a crash, but nobody's going to say, "Oh, terrible crash. That window must be in tremendous pain." No, I mean you will hear a sound, you will hear a crash. But you don't think that the window is in pain. Descartes would say exactly the same thing applies to animals. Animals do not experience pain, although they exhibit what we call pain behavior. So that's some of the problems with Descartes. You've got the mind-body problem, the problem of the external world, skepticism about the external world, skepticism about other minds, the problem of sleep, and the problem of other animals. There's other problems too, but I'll just stop at that. Okay, now, so Descartes, the thing about Descartes, Cartesian dualism, is that he was never able to get the mind and the body together. He was never able to do it. Basically, you have, Descartes' view is that the world is split into two. You have minds and you have bodies, and bodies are basically just very, very complicated machines that operate according to the laws of physics. So the mind is, for Descartes, only the human beings, again, have souls, have minds, and that means we have free will because the soul for Descartes is free. It has free will. It can make its own choices. Everything else other than a soul for Descartes is subject to the laws of science. So everything is determined by the laws of physics. There's no free will outside of the human soul. So that's basically the Cartesian view. Now, let me say a little about the background in Descartes' day. Descartes is living in a day when Aristotelianism is breaking up, the Aristotelian view of the world full of purposes and so on, and it's being replaced by a mechanical picture of the world where everything operates according to mechanical laws. In Descartes' day, science did not exist, so no one really knew. Descartes was born in 1597 and he died in 1650. In 1633, Galileo was arrested by the Inquisition and put in prison, house imprisonment, for advocating that the Earth revolved around the sun. So in Descartes' day, science did not exist as it does in our day. I mean, in his day, there was no even agreement as to whether the sun went around the earth or the earth went around the sun. That's incomprehensible in the 21st century. I mean, everybody knows that. 5-year-old kids know that. But in Descartes' day, they didn't know that. So science in Descartes' day, there was no science in the sense that we mean it today. One of Descartes' biggest tasks, what he saw his task was to provide a foundation. What Descartes was really interested in was providing a foundation on which to build science. Foundation, okay? So he wanted to provide a foundation on which science could be created and could be created. In his day, science did not exist. To understand Descartes, you have to understand. Descartes not only was a great philosopher, but he was a great scientist, a great mathematician. What Descartes was after was to find a method on which science could be built. After he went to the best schools in his day, and after he graduated from high school, he said, I don't really know anything yet because everything I know is based upon authority of the church or authority of Aristotle. There's no real knowledge. And so what Descartes, his basic task was to set out to create a foundation for science. And he did so. What was going to be the foundation for science science for Descartes was going to be based upon his distinction between minds and bodies. He divides the worlds up into the mental and the physical. The sciences are going to be based upon his understanding, the scientific understanding of bodies, of the physical. Religion would get the mind, science would get the body, objects. So basically, I'll talk about that in another lecture, but because this one's running out of time, I'm running out of time. But That's all for this lecture, and I'll continue it in my next lecture.